food and ag, indigenous land use, a lot of other things. So, all of those different industry verticals that are kind of implicated in climate. So in terms of my personal backgrounds, I've been working in climate my entire career in a really wide range of positions. So worked in everything from academic research to working at a regulatory agency. I've been on the board of directors of a granting organization, so I've been on that side of things. Um, I've worked in bioenergy for some time, first on the engineering and design side, and then running a manufacturing group. And then I moved over to run global project development, so developing bioenergy projects in the United States and 40 different countries around the world. Worked in climate-related sustainable development as well. And then during my time working in bioenergy and also in sustainable development, I was working in climate startups while also helping them secure millions of dollars in grant funding. Really saw firsthand how this form of funding could really transform the trajectory of a climate tech company. And after I moved back to the US after living abroad for a few years, kind of immersed in the international funding space, I founded CFS in early 2020, really to, instead of just kind of transforming one company at a time, to be able to kind of scale my impact to a lot of different companies at once. And, at the time, I've been working in climate or with grants since 2004. So I've kind of seen the trends in the space, and there was this, grant funding for climate had been building for a few years. But in 2020, 2021, there was really this inflection point that was hitting, and I wanted to make sure that the highest impact climate startups could access this giant new wave of grant funding that was coming into the ecosystem. So since I founded the company in 2020, we've secured over $778 million as a company with over a 90% success rate. We are a global company. We work globally. We have clients on 6 continents. Our team is distributed all over the world. So North America, Africa, Europe. We're hiring some folks in Asia now as well. Very experienced team in terms of fundraising. So our collective amount that we've raised is over $2 billion. And I think one of our other differentiators is our technical depth. So our technical team is composed almost entirely of PhDs. A lot of us also have developed and scaled climate tech companies. So we've kind of gone through that cycle. We've been on the side of the table of our clients. We've gone through R&D in the product development cycle and commercialization and taking products to scale. A couple folks on the team have taken climate tech companies public even. So we've kind of been on that journey from startup to scale, but we also know how to secure large scale grant funding at every step of the way. So we're able to kind of do secure grant funding, but also do all of the other things that are required for these really large scale projects, like engaging with funders, developing strategic partnerships, doing project design, providing those other kind of technical and commercial consulting services as well that are really required to be successful. So excuse me. So as I said, kind of grant funding for climate has been growing for some time, but is really taking off, and has taken off in the last few years. So this chart shows the 3 big climate bills that have happened. This is U.S. federal spending, and this is just the 3 latest climate bills in this last bar here. It doesn't even show the approximately $30 billion in annual appropriations for climate that had already been happening. So, we're totaling 110, $115 billion every single year for the next, until 2026. And that's just from the US federal government. There's obviously hundreds of billions of dollars available now from a wide range of other funders. We're at about $1 trillion now for climate finance, although we know that we're going to need $4 or $5 trillion per year by 2030 to actually solve the climate crisis. So we're not really close to where we need to be, but we're actually starting to get to a place where we actually might it feels like we actually might get there. And it's not just kind of the amount of funding that's changing, it's also the size of the awards. So at CFS, we currently have a pipeline of about $2 billion in terms of grants that have been submitted and are pending approval and are works in progress. A couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago now, we submitted over $1 billion in a single week with 2 grants. One was about 800 million and one was about 250 million. So the sizes of grants are just increasing exponentially, and along with the availability of funding. As I said, I've been working with grants for almost 20 years, and I've just never seen anything like this. So there's never been a better time to secure grant funding for climate. And at this point, in my opinion, it's almost a strategic imperative for climate startups and small companies and even larger companies to be looking at grant funding as a key source of capital along with the rest of the capital stack. So in addition to kind of the availability of funding, it's not just the US federal government or the EU or other national governments. The funding increase is really coming from all categories of funder, right? So there's like $500 billion in the US, $600 billion from the EU Green Deal, state and provincial governments, foundations. So there's new entrants coming in that are oftentimes fully climate focused. Incumbent foundations are reorienting, albeit slowly, but they are. There's more corporate direct funding. There's more funding in the developing world. Although certainly the biggest story over the last couple of years has been the opening of the floodgates of public funding. And that's mostly where we work, because that's really where the largest value opportunities are. So another trend is that funding is not only greater coming from all these different types of funder, but also it's more evenly distributed throughout all the different industry verticals. So there are a lot of sectors and solutions that have been underfunded previously that are getting more funded, right? So some of these are kind of these difficult to abate in industries like industrial decarbonization, buildings, agriculture, aviation, cutting edge technologies like carbon removal, hydrogen. So things are changing a lot in this funding ecosystem and changing very rapidly. It's different than it was 12, 18, 24, 36 months ago. So just going over the funding landscape in a little bit more detail here. The federal funding landscape, I already talked a little bit about that. So the federal government was spending 28 billion, 30 billion in, through just annual appropriations, and that was increasing year over year. The new climate bills have added another $80 billion a year in climate spending on top of that. There's expanded loan authority for the DOE Loan Programs Office. So those are primarily loan guarantees, mostly for climate tech, some other solutions as well. So that's like, $250 billion right there, which is massive. And that also is designed to crowd in other private sector funding as well. So these 3 major bills that have been happening in the US total, almost 500 billion, maybe even more, if these IRA incentives are growing, which is incredible. It's a complete. If you could mute, that would be helpful. Thanks. And kind of shockingly, US Congress did a really good job of kind of applying this funding strategically across the technical adoption S-curve. So the CHIPS and Science Act was, most of that funding went to kind of semiconductor R&D and production, but it actually provided, over $10 billion in funding for really early stage R&D, really fundamental R&D through the Department of Energy Office of Science, the National Science Foundation, had a number of focus areas like hydrogen, carbon removal, different forms of renewables, hydrogen, and bioeconomy, I believe. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is colloquially known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That was about a $1.2 trillion in spending. About 100 billion of that was dedicated to climate. And that was really more focused on kind of funding development, demonstration, and some early deployment. So kind of providing that larger scale infrastructure that climate technologies need to scale at speed. And so a lot of these, hundreds of millions of dollars, specific opportunities that we're working on are coming from that program. And then of course there's the Inflation Reduction Act, the big one that everyone knows about, that allocated $369 billion to climate. So the biggest single national funding allocation in history. Obviously, the EU itself has provided more in a single allocation. And IRA is primarily aimed at kind of the later stage of the S curve, so driving investment growth through these demand pull measures that kind of provide security for more mature climate technologies, or climate technologies to kind of go that final stage to reach market maturity. So you're seeing a lot in that bill, a lot of incentives and tax credits for things like electric vehicles and heat pumps and home upgrades, but it is providing a lot of funding across multiple phases here as well, and seeing major grant and other funding across a wide range of industries, and grant funding also for these later stage technologies, which was the $800 billion opportunity we just submitted was from the Inflation Reduction Act. So very, very large grants. I think, of this 500 billion, well over 100 billion of this is grant funding. In the US, state climate spending is also increasing significantly. So in 2022, the 2022 budget, California passed a bill that allocated over $54 billion for the next 6 years. There's likely more spending to come from California, and a lot of this funding, especially in the state level, is not as much kind of fundamental research, but it's more kind of like applied research, demonstration, and deployment. So a lot of this is accessible by climate companies and startups. The other big player, relatively speaking, in the US is New York. So they've allocated over $10 billion. They have another couple billion coming out with this new governor. And then there's other states that are significantly increasing what they're doing, like Washington, Massachusetts, and others. Those are kind of on the grant side, and there's other states that have other forms of non-dilutive funding, like incentives that for things like advanced manufacturing that are not necessarily explicitly related to climate. Certain states that are not necessarily explicitly friendly to climate, but they're providing incentives to renewable energy, advanced manufacturing that climate companies are taking advantage of. Obviously, other funding from corporates and others in the US as well. So in Europe, obviously, a lot of big funding pools for climate. There's the Horizon Europe program that a lot of folks are probably familiar with. This is a lot of directly accessible grants. A lot of them are accessible through consortia. About a third of that $95 billion fund is directly dedicated to climate, so around $31 billion. The EU Life program is a longer running program that's allocated about $5 billion, over 7 years, and this is more on the kind of environment, nature, conservation side, but a lot related to climate and kind of nature-based solutions. And then the Innovation Fund, which is about $10 billion fund, which is a newer fund that funds various types of climate technologies. And then obviously there's more funding available from the EU and national governments there as well, but some very big pools that are directly accessible with grant funding for climate. So just to kind of give a sense of scale, annually from foundations for climate, there's about $1.9 billion per year available. So still only about 2% of global philanthropy goes to climate, and the majority of that is not allocated to the climate sector. It's kind of just like VCs are optimized for the private sector. Philanthropies are really optimized for nonprofits and NGOs. That there is an increasing trend of them kind of funding more private sector companies, whether that is through direct grants or donor advised funds or PRIs, program related investments. But there are these kind of newer foundations that are coming into the space that are much more climate aligned, more flexible, kind of less ossified, you might say, than some of these incumbent philanthropies, often backed by these kind of newly climate concerned high net worth individuals, or groups of them. So there is more funding from these foundations from the private sector, but still kind of, as a sense of scale, and obviously we need more funding from philanthropy for climate. Even just California alone provides 5 times more per year than global philanthropy. So just to give a sense of scale of what is available with public funding versus philanthropic funding, which is not to say there is not a role for philanthropic funding. There definitely is, especially kind of like earlier as catalytic capital for spinouts, blended finance as well. Prime Coalition kind of has pioneered some of that work. So there's definitely a role for philanthropy in doing great work, but in terms of scale, public funding is just dwarfs that. In the developing world for climate, there's annually about $34 billion available through multilaterals for climate. So that's organizations like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. $28 billion to bilateral institutions. So, development aid agencies like USAID or GAZ in Germany, and development finance institutions as well. About 1/3 of that funding is in grants. There's more loans available through those organizations. There definitely needs to be more. This is one of, if not the biggest gap in climate finance. As we know, the majority of emissions going forward are going to be coming from non-industrialized countries, and we just have to do a much better job of helping those countries do just leapfrog the energy transition. And if we're not, there's great work going on in the industrialized world, but if we're not helping the developing world, then we're not going to solve climate. So shifting gears a little bit here, this is the kind of an overview of the process for securing grant funding if you're doing it right. And so from identification and assessment through intense project design and scoping, developing partnerships, which is always critical with larger scale grant funding, obviously creating the actual proposal, and then once you win, post-award management of the grant and also implementation as well of the project. So we don't have time to go through this whole process here, but I wanted to kind of talk through a couple of the most important steps and how to kind of think about those. So starting at the beginning, a lot of folks are sometimes surprised to hear me say that identification and assessment is actually the most important stage, not the proposal stage. And I say this because if you're pursuing the wrong grant, then you're just wasting your time, or you're maybe chasing funding off your roadmap, which can be almost as bad if you get the grant and then you have all this really big distraction. So it's really important to take a step back and take a comprehensive and much more strategic view of the ecosystem before you start working on grants. So that's kind of on the identification side. And then with assessment, you need to think about that on multiple levels. So kind of what's the basic eligibility? Obviously, you need to be eligible or eligible through a partnership. And you need to do a mini scoping or project design with each opportunity to see, okay, does this fit my existing roadmap? And does this align also with the funder focus, right? And you may need to do a little bit more of a deep dive to kind of find the subtleties in these programs and with these funders. I think a key piece of the assessment here is engaging with the funders or the program managers themselves. That helps with assessment. So that's something we always do before submitting a grant, is get some direct information from the funder, have them give us a thumbs up or thumbs down. We really we only go into grants that we have very high confidence that we can win, which is how we have gotten to a 90% success rate, and engaging with the funders is a key part of that. But kind of thinking about this identification and assessment stage as a whole, one thing I've observed is that certainly not all, but many companies that are pursuing grant funding are doing it very opportunistically. Even companies that have been pretty successful at it have done it very opportunistically. So they kind of something comes across their desk, or someone tells them about an opportunity, or maybe they do a search and an individual aggregator for the specific things that they're working on, and it's just not the most strategic or even efficient way of pursuing grant funding. And so we have developed a more standardized process we call mapping the funding ecosystem that provides a more strategic approach. So, starting with kind of understanding the company's specific funding priorities, undertaking a really comprehensive survey of the ecosystem. So looking at literally thousands of opportunities, hundreds of funders, and then down selecting based on the company's funding priorities, do multiple rounds of down selection to create a funding pipeline that's ranked and prioritized. And what this process allows us to do is identify the opportunities with the highest probability of award, and also are the most well aligned with the company's technology and or commercialization roadmap. And the other important thing it allows us to do is not just kind of only be working on or be limited to the opportunities that are out right now, and always kind of be scrambling to make up time. It enables us to kind of take a step back, see the trends in the ecosystem, see the opportunities that are going to be coming down the pike, going to be released in the future, that are recurring opportunities, and plan farther in advance, right? And it also allows us to be taking that step back and create an integrated fundraising strategy. So to be successful, it's really important to take advantage of the full capital stack, right? So in this environment, it can be a key competitive advantage. And there's just so much funding out there, so much grant funding. As I said, I think it's really a strategic imperative for climate-related companies to be looking at this form of funding, but also understanding how to effectively integrate all of the different forms of capital that's available to you, and both to kind of obviously get additional funding, but also take advantage of all of the different benefits of those different types of funding, and enable each to kind of mitigate the drawbacks of the other as well, right? I mean, pursuing grant funding, as I know very well, and some of you probably know very well, it is a very complex process. It can be very time consuming and very resource consuming. There's substantial post-award management that's required. There are lag times, right, between the time you apply for the award and you actually receive the funding. But it's actually a great form of capital because it doesn't require you to give up equity. And it kind of provides this more patient, risk-tolerant capital than some other forms of funding. And it can actually help you secure equity and secure debt financing, oftentimes on more advantageous terms. Investment funding can be very complementary to grant funding, right? It can help kind of provide runway to get through those lag times. It can sometimes be faster to secure, and it is definitely more flexible, right? Grants are usually based on a specific project that you design the project, but it's still for a specific purpose, and you have to adhere to that purpose more or less. Investment funding can be a lot more flexible, but as we know, especially for founders, equity investment is the most expensive form of capital. So you want to limit the amount of equity that you're having to take on, especially early on in the business when you're having to give up more, right? Debt financing also is a great source of non-dilutive funding, but especially for things like paying for capex or paying for demonstration or commercial plants. But it can be hard for climate companies, especially earlier stage companies, to access this sort of capital. There are newer companies like Enduring Planet and others that are out there kind of with newer models and newer, more flexible and faster models for climate tech companies, but it can still be hard to access. But grant funding, in an individual project, kind of bringing in grant funding can help bring in debt financing as co-financing as well, but it still can be more difficult to access. The important thing with what we call an integrated fundraising strategy, there's no one size fits all, right? I can't say, okay, we'll have this percentage of grants and this percentage of equity and this percentage of debt, right? It's different for different companies. It's different at the different stages at which you're going to be operating. And it's different for different products, right? And so the strategy really needs to be tailored to the needs of the individual company, right? And so you need to kind of look at your technology roadmap, look at your pathway to commercialization and scale, and then use the available non-dilutive funding that's identified in the ecosystem mapping process that you've done, and match that funding up with the relevant points in your roadmap. Once you do that, you can kind of identify, here are the holes, here are the gaps where we need maybe equity investment to fill this, or maybe we should take debt financing for this specific project, or maybe the other way around, right? If you know when your equity rounds are going to be, or maybe your next equity round is going to be, you know what you're going to apply that funding to, where are the gaps that you need additional funding that maybe grants can fill. So a couple of final thoughts here. I think, as I said, incredibly important to engage with funders on a variety of levels and different times. Obviously with assessment, but also with scoping and just getting them to know your technology. There are different ways to go about it, right? There's kind of these official channels, whether you're responding to requests for information, participating in workshops, expert feedback sessions. Pretty much every public agency worldwide has this, those official channels. But also, more informal direct outreach can be really effective, right? So once the ecosystem map kind of tells you where the majority of the funding is going to come out, and there's always kind of insights and patterns that pop out of that process. We'll just do direct outreach to the relevant departments and program managers, whether that's for a specific funding opportunity or just general where we've seen additional funding coming out. And so that's obviously getting advice on fit, scoping, just getting to know them. In many cases we've seen that they're interested in what is this technology, pitching them on the technology, and oftentimes that does translate into future opportunities as well. So it's really valuable. Grants are more than just about the money, right? Money is great. It's the main purpose. But it's also about kind of this validation from agencies. And I've actually been saying this for a long time. And then I was on a panel with Doug Schultz, the COO of the Department of Energy Office of Clean Energy Demonstration, and he said this on a panel that we were on. So I felt fairly vindicated from that. That's it's getting this validation. These agencies do a really deep dive into your technology, and oftentimes investors and even debt financiers really take that seriously. That's really important validation. It can be really helpful in developing partnerships. So as I said, with excuse me, with these larger scale grants, these partnerships are oftentimes required, or if they're not, it's still a good idea. And bringing a grant funding to a partner that you may have kind of wanted to work with for a while, or maybe wouldn't have otherwise considered working with you, can be really important. And I've seen companies many times bring a grant funding to a partnership, develop a partnership through that process, and then even if the grant isn't awarded, that partnership still kind of survives and they still do the project in some form or another. So that's a really important function. And for earlier stage companies, it can actually be a forcing function with these grants to develop their team, develop their processes, develop their strategy, right? If it's a 3 to 5 year grant and you kind of have a 2-year commercialization plan mapped out really well, you need to figure out what you're going to do for those 5 years and then several years beyond that to really apply for the grant. So it can be a really important forcing function. And if you're working with a consultant like us, we can help guide you in doing those things and provide technical and commercial consulting as well. And then really emphasize equity and justice and doing projects in the developing world and historically underserved communities. Obviously, it's just the right thing to do in general, and we do apply an equity and justice lens when we decide that the projects and clients that we are going to take on. And we've been doing this for many, many years before this was kind of a bigger thing. But now there's a ton of funding directed at this. And in many cases, there are specific funding opportunities directed at environmental justice or climate justice, but even funding opportunities that are not specifically focused on this, you can get extra points for being in an underserved community, or they require a significant amount of community engagement and real community engagement, right? And it actually can not only help you get funding, but it can help your project be more successful, right? If you're engaging with the community, really understanding, if you're putting project on the ground, really understanding the community, what their concerns are, what the atmosphere is going to be like, it can really help with project implementation as well. Not only kind of making sure that there's not going to be community opposition, but also just helping you understand how to better design and implement the project. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening so politely, and I'll turn it back over to Nadia to help kind of facilitate the Q&A here.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Joel. There's a lot of information to digest there, and hopefully made things a little bit less overwhelming for people. While I still know, yeah, grants are definitely a big beast, and funding in general. So we have actually a good, healthy amount of questions in the chat. So I'll start from the top. From Molly, she asked, how competitive are these grants? And are there tens of applicants, hundreds, just a few? Also, feel free to like turn your video on, go off mute if you guys want to ask anything in question in a second after we go through the posted questions as well.
Yeah, it's a great question, Molly. It really depends on the program, right? So some of these applications have thousands of applicants. So the the SBIR program, Small Business Innovation Research program, is very well known in the United States. That can be very, I mean, there are hundreds of millions of dollars applied to that, so it's a very large pool of funding, but there are thousands of applicants to that program. I think the success rate is about 17%, I believe. I mean, our success rate is obviously much higher there, but you're competing against a lot of different applicants. Some of these larger Department of Energy programs have, or Horizon programs do have hundreds of applicants for sometimes very limited spots. But one of the benefits of doing an ecosystem mapping process is that you can understand not only the grants that are out there, but all different features of different grants. So you can find more niche grants that are maybe even more well suited to the specific thing that you're doing, that are less well known, that you have a higher chance of winning, and that are less competitive, right? And so that's why that's one of the reasons why it's so important to take a really strategic look at the ecosystem and not just apply for the things that are really well known. Sometimes applying for those programs is great. You're a great fit. You've engaged with the funder. They've given you the thumbs up. You have a great project and a great team, and you have a really high chance of winning. And I know a lot of folks who win those, and we win a lot of those. But it's one of the things that you want to look at when you're doing your ecosystem mapping process. And I should just say, we don't have a monopoly on doing ecosystem mapping. Like, the process I described can literally be done by anyone. We've just kind of made it a bit more standardized and rigorous, but anyone can do this. And I would encourage, most people don't hire a consultant. Most people do grants on their own. And for anyone who's doing grants, I would really encourage you to do some form of that process, because it is really helpful.
Definitely, even if it's just a dirty list of everything to try to see what's out there and what might fit best.
Yep.
We have one also from Tarvo. In the EU, there are a lot of local grants that are often not simple to find for companies wanting to enter foreign markets. Do you have an extensive system or list for such a list from each geography?
So the one of the issues is that there really isn't one particular list. There are a variety of what they call grant aggregators. So different databases that have uh, many different grants from many areas, but a lot of these aggregators are specific in terms of the geography that they're looking in, or they may be specific to an industry vertical. So what I encourage you to do is not just try to go and look at necessarily for you start with looking for individual grants, but try to figure out what is the aggregator that best serves my needs in terms of in terms of where I'm going geographically and what my topic area is. But also, you don't want to define what you're working on too narrowly. A critical part of the mapping process is thinking about not only let's say you're a battery company. You don't just want to look at opportunities for your specific battery chemistry, right? Because that's really going to limit you in terms of what you're looking at. You want to define, well, what are the applications of your battery technology? Maybe that has to do with grid services, or grid firming, or maybe that has to do with building decarbonization. So you want to define that broadly and then identify the different databases or aggregators that kind of serve those purposes. But there isn't a central clearinghouse for all of those things. So you do have to do a little bit of research, but I encourage you to not start with looking necessarily for individual grants, but looking for the aggregation sources where there are a list of grants. There is oftentimes a very extensive list. But there are different ones for different geographies that in topic areas. So you have to kind of do that research first in terms of where you're going to find those grants.
Yeah, that's true. One from Verus. What is the average money size of grant applications in the US? And can smaller companies apply for funding too? Oh, I had a question about the size too, because when you were saying that there was such a growth in the last few years, I was wondering if it was just in terms of quantity, or is it also in terms of ticket size?
It's really all of the above. I don't have the data on what the average size is, but there's a really wide range of grant sizes, right? There are grants that are 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, a million, 2 million, 5 million, 25 million, 60 million, 150 million, 300 million, 800 million. So, and we applied for all those, although now we really only apply for things that are kind of in the million or multi-million dollar range at the minimum. But in this environment, with this super abundance of grant funding, I think one of the other issues that I see is kind of a lack of imagination on the part of smaller companies. They think that it's kind of like back in the day where you really had to say, okay, I'll apply for a $250,000 grant, and then maybe a 500K, and then maybe a million. That's not how it is anymore. A small company, I've seen companies with 3 people win $2 to $5 million grants. Like in this environment of super abundance of grants, if you're identifying the right ones, smaller companies can really do well with larger grants. Sometimes maybe it's a phased award system. I should let me stop my screen share here. Sometimes it's a phased award system, but you can apply for larger grants, absolutely. And there's still a range, but the top of that range is a lot more.
Yeah, in that case, sorry, I'm jumping in with a question myself based on that, but is there ever a case where grants aren't actually don't find a good fit for an applicant, and whether they then reopen it or kind of allocate it to something that is maybe not the exact criteria that they were looking for? Does that happen ever? Because it sounds almost like there's more funding available than not applicants. Obviously there's lots of applicants, but if there's not a lot of creativity sometimes.
You're saying, do grants not out there? Are there grant programs that don't allocate all of the available funding.
Yeah, if they don't find a good match, let's say.
Yeah, I think that does sometimes happen. I think usually there are more applicants
Yeah.
than that are qualified. So, and oftentimes, especially with public grants, they kind of have a mandate to spend most of that money. Although they usually say in the in the solicitation that they reserve the right to not put all the money out. I think most of the time they do put all of that funding out, but it certainly does happen and has happened before.
Yeah, got it. All right, a few more questions. I'm trying to see if I should. All right, so a little bit similar, but to earlier. But can you bring examples of grants for early stage pre-revenue climate startups that they can apply to with less than 6 months decision process and approval? All right, that's quite filterable.
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, we work with public funding, and I think there are very few opportunities that have less than 6 or fewer than 6 months in in the approval. You may have you may be approved at 6 months, which would be like on the very early side. Oftentimes it's 7 to 9 months before approval, and then there's a 4 to 8 week approval or contract negotiation process, and then you start work, and then you provide oftentimes they're reimbursable grants, although there are some I mentioned during Planet previously who provides short-term debt financing against a grant that's been awarded, so you can get money early and start work. Um, and so, between the time of applying for the grant and actually getting the funding, you're usually looking at 8 to 12 months. If it's a larger grant, sometimes a contract negotiation process. So we recently won an award it's going to be between 500 $600 million. The grant negotiation process has been going on for months, and we expect it to go on to like maybe the mid to end of the first quarter of next year. Obviously, there's a lot to work out with this program, and that's definitely an outlier. It's not what you probably would be applying to if you're a pre-revenue startup. But just to give you a sense, I think the average, if you're average time to money is for a public funding opportunity is probably, um, you know, I would say 8 to 12 months. There are very few that are going to be less than 6 months. If that's what you're looking for, probably philanthropic grants. But again, if you're a startup, it's harder to access that ecosystem. What I usually tell people is if you don't have a 12 to 18 months runway, then you should not be relying on grant funding for your capital. You should be looking at grant funding definitely and continuing to work on that, but you need to try to find other forms of capital as well, given that grants aren't necessarily guaranteed and there is that lag time. You don't want to be putting all of your eggs in the grants basket. As talked about, there's an integrated fundraising strategy there.
Yeah, definitely.
I think for examples of early stage pre-revenue climate startups, it really is going to depend on where you're located in the world. Oftentimes in Europe, those are going to be more likely national national grants. In the United States, things like the Small Business Innovation Research um, uh, program are for earlier stage companies. But the thing is, like, a lot of these companies that are applying to grants, even larger grants, are still pre-revenue, right? I mean, there's a lot of companies that have even grown fairly large that are still pre-revenue, right? A lot of companies take a while to start really generating revenue. So there are a lot of grants, even larger grants, that are available for pre-revenue kind of startups.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay, next question from Nishan. Bit more, yeah, site specific again, but I'm an international student from Sri Lanka pursuing a PhD in a leading university in the UK with my research focused on climate finance and the creation of a model to estimate climate risk in business organizations using satellite data. That's a mouthful. How can I secure funding to cover project costs and partially offset tuition fees?
Yeah, so I think there are different forms of funding available for different types of entities or situations. I think obviously academic research funding is very common. So there are a variety of government programs within within the UK. I think that if you are at a university and you're pursuing a PhD and you want grant funding, pretty much every single university or college is going to have, they do a lot of grants work. So the best thing to do is actually talk to the grants people at your specific university to understand. Oftentimes universities have partnerships with funding organizations, or they understand the specific funders. Even if they don't have a partnership with the university, they know where a lot of the funding comings is coming from for your specific department, because they know what grants have been applied there previously. So I think certainly it's always a good idea to understand the ecosystem and do your own ecosystem mapping process. But if you're working in a university and you're a postdoc or a graduate student and you need to fund your research, talking to the grants department and the grants folks at your specific university is usually a good first step, in addition to doing your own ecosystem mapping.
Yeah, I'd also recommend, it doesn't necessarily offset tuition fees, but around project costs in the UK is Innovation UK grants, because a lot of them require research bases and support research to market projects. But yeah. Tarvo asks, who's writing the applications? Your team looks rather small.
Well, we have about 20 27, 28 people. If you include other like part-time contractors, we have somewhere in the 30s. So I guess small is probably relative. So we have a lot of people that are writing grants. You can go to our website and see the grant development leads and grant writers. There are a lot of folks that work with us that are not on the website as well. But we do pretty high volume of grants. As I said, our pipeline is about $2 billion. So we have a lot of great people on the team that are writing the grants.
Great, thanks. Which I think covers the next question also about the last slide. Is the same if there is one founder but with a team? About the last slide, is it the same if there is one founder but with a team? I guess it's more about about the.
I'm not 100% sure what that is asking, but I think maybe you're asking what did. Feel free to jump on.
Yeah, if you want to unmute and clarify.
But I think maybe what you're at, yeah.
Hi everyone. I have a project with a startup and I'm the only founder. So what I'm asking is if I can apply with one only founder but with a team, or the founder is I don't know.
Okay, yeah, got it. So a couple of things. So number one, if you are a sole founder and applying for grants, there are grants out there for that. Maybe a little more limited, but there are definitely grants out there for that. Oftentimes what you want to do is you can work through partnerships, right? So you can partner with other organizations that may have more capacity and build out a project team where you can say, okay, my company is going to play this function in the project design, and this other company or this other organization is going to play this function in the project design, and together we will all be able to carry out this project. Oftentimes when you have grant funding as well, you say, okay, here's our budget, and we have me here, that I'm a full-time employee, and then we have this other role, and we've defined the role really well. It's a TBD hire, but that's a really very common line item in a grant. If you're going for larger grants, you don't want it to all just be one founder and a bunch of TBD hires. So what you can do is have someone that you maybe want to work with, but you haven't you don't work with them currently, but if you get a grant, you will work with them. And so you can put them into the budget as a team member, or maybe as a consultant, and kind of make your team. You're not obfuscating exactly and lying to the agency, but you're just saying, okay, if we win the grant, we will have this we will have this team and what they're really looking for. Certainly there's some track record that you have to talk about in most of these grants and convince them that you have the expertise and capacity to carry it out. But part of that also is the folks that are going to be on your team. So through partnerships, through defining TBD roles, and then also having folks that you want to work with and having those folks on the project team as well. Those are, I think that's probably the attack I would take. So there's actually a lot of ways if you're a sole founder to still secure grant funding.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Joel. Okay, so 3 minutes and 3 questions left. So here we go, rapid fire.
Yeah.
From Tarvo, how do you price your services?
Yeah, great question. So the ecosystem mapping process, because it's more or less a standardized process, we know how long that's going to take for a specific industry vertical or specific set of countries. We can do a global search, but usually what we want to do in order to prioritize things is understand where are your priority regions or your priority countries, and it's very flexible. So we just did a regenerative grazing project they wanted to look in Australia, Mongolia, and California, right? So it's very specific, but we were able to do that because it's a very broad-based search, but it's very flexible as well. So we know how long it's going to take based on the number of countries or regions or or industry verticals, and so that's just going to be flat rate pricing. Everything after that, we just do an hourly consulting fee. So there's no award fees that we do. We just work on an hourly consulting basis, and that just kind of keeps it simple for everyone. Obviously, we provide a time estimate prior to starting a project. There's no surprise billing or anything, but we just generally use an hourly consulting fee for that.
Got it. From Mark Phillips, any lessons on how to approach partner engagement at the early stage when you need multiple partners, but not sure yet who will make the cut for final partnership structure?
Yeah, great question, Mark. So I think that there have been many times where we have asked a broader range of partners than we have necessarily needed for letters of commitment or letters of support. You don't have to use all of the letters of commitment or support that you secure in the grant. So that's one way, is to just say, okay, well, we're still working on the project design through the application process. We think this is the set of folks we might need. There might be a couple of superfluous ones, but obviously, as you well know, you need to get started early on that engagement work, because that's the one thing that you can't control the timing of. And so sometimes just getting all of those different, maybe more letters than you necessarily need. And then also, there can be, agencies understand if they award you a grant. That's why there is a contract negotiation process, because there are changes to the scope. There are changes to the budget that are done through that process, and so you do have the opportunity of changing partners at that time, or even during the grant structure, or sorry, the course of implementing the grant. There are also opportunities to change the partners that you're working with. There's usually a process for changing the scope, and then also you want to build in some flexibility as well as you're writing the grant into the scope, into the budget, so that you do have, ideally some latitude to make changes even without talking to the funder. But there's always a process for the funder. Like I've worked on grants that, implementing grants where we changed the site 3 different times and we had to get approval from the funder each time, but we ended up with a better site and we did the project really well. And so the funder was okay with that. So as long as you're keeping the lines of communication open with the funder, trying to give yourself as much latitude on the front end with how you're designing the project, and maybe sometimes getting more partnership letters than you need. That's how I would go about that.
Cool. I know we're on the hour, but if possible, I'm going to squeeze in the last question. So from Cynthia, if I do the application 1 year before, my action plan, maybe it will have a great change. What can we do?
Yeah, so I just addressed that a little bit. So you want to just build as much flexibility into your project as much as you can. Obviously, you do need to define a specific project, but there are different ways that you can build flexibility into your budget and flexibility into your scope. There's also an opportunity to change the scope during the contract negotiation process. That's probably the easiest time, but there are avenues for changing once you have the award. I think if you go through a full business pivot before you're awarded the grant and the grant is awarded, if it's going to be a distraction or not what you want to do anymore, I usually advise people to just not take the grant. You're worse off having a grant that's going to be a distraction and doing a bunch of extra work that is not going to accelerate you down your pathway than saying, I'm going to apply for a different grant or I'm going to get some other source of funding. But there are at the same time, that's kind of like the last resort. And so there are things that you want to do. Hopefully you know that there might be the possibility for a pivot within the next year. And so you can build that flexibility in and then use those multiple touch points with the agency or funder in order to make those changes to the scope.
Right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Joel. Those are some great tips and insights. And apologies, folks, we've run over, so we're going to end it now. But thank you again, Joel. That was a really helpful presentation. If you guys have any more questions or want to use Climate Finance Solutions, please get in touch with Joel at Climate Finance Solutions. And otherwise, again, would love to have you guys join our community if you haven't already. Ultimately looking at catalyzing the ecosystem to support funding and collaborations to enable positive impact at a previously unimaginable scale. So let's go out and do that and get some really big grants out there to support that as well. So thanks again and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free to email me directly, or there's a contact info on our website as well. So contact us however you want, and we'll happy to speak with you.
Sounds good. Great. Thanks,
Nadia.
guys. Bye, Joel.
Bye.